This episode is brought to you by Batiste Dry Shampoo. Whether you're on the go, at the gym, or getting ready for a night out, Batiste has a dry shampoo for you. Refresh with over 10 signature fragrances. Or try Batiste Hint of Color, a tinted dry shampoo that seamlessly blends with your hair. Need an extra boost? Try Batiste Dry Shampoo with added benefits like volumizing, texturizing, and more. Buy Batiste now, in-store or online at your nearest retailer.
Hello there and welcome to the Byline podcast with me, Adrian Goldberg. This time, fuel, freebies and fallout. Less than 3 months into his Premiership, Keir Starmer is having to face up to the realities of life inside the pressure cooker of number 10. How well is he doing? We're going to be chatting to Byline Times political editor Adam Bienkov and Steve McCabe, a Labour MP, until he stepped down at the last election. First, though, let's set the scene. There has been a mini rebellion by backbench Labour MPs over the decision to scrap winter fuel payments for millions of pensioners. Meanwhile, the PM is seen to be living the high life at the expense of wealthy donors. An executive box at Arsenal, free specs and clothes paid for by Labour peer Lord Wahid Ali. And the latest revelation, news that Special Advisor Sue Gray is paid more than Starmer himself. The fact that this story is out there is arguably less about the money than what it reveals about conflicts at the top of government between Gray and other members of Keir Starmer's team. So let's welcome Adam with a view from Westminster. Adam, I know these are quite disparate strands in a way, but they all add up in these early months of Keir Starmer's prime ministership of a rather embattled prime minister.
Yes, we always have this idea that when there's a change of government, there tends to be a sort of honeymoon period. And I think if there was a honeymoon period for this government, it was incredibly brief. As soon as the summer ended, we're straight into a row over the winter fuel payments. This is a bit of a curious one for me, in that it was predicated on the idea that government finances are in a dire state and we need to find lots of money from here, there and everywhere. But to focus on this particular issue, winter fuel payments, which, according to the government's own figures, cost just over £1 billion, which is a tiny amount in terms of total government spending. And to focus on that, which is hugely unpopular, is not going to do much to fix the finances. It's gone down terribly badly with most Labour MPs who don't really understand why they've taken this decision now, why it wasn't left until the budget, why they couldn't have found some other means to find the money to fund this. There doesn't seem to be an obvious reason why they've gone down this route to me.
And of course, it goes to the heart of Labour's mission. I recognise that the poorest pensioners, those on pension credit, will still get the winter fuel payment. But there are many tens of thousands of pensioners who don't qualify for pension credit, but who are nevertheless going to find it quite hard to pay their energy bills this winter, as the backlash to the plan has shown.
Yes, and the government's position is that they're committed to the triple lock for pensioners. So overall, in the course of time, pensioners will be no worse off. But of course, there is going to be the problem this winter, and there will be people who fall through the cracks and don't apply for pensioner credit who otherwise would be eligible for it. And so people will suffer as a result of it. There's also a point of principle here. I mean, the Labour Party for a long time has been committed to the idea of universal benefits. We've seen the extension of some universal benefits in recent years. In London, we've had the Mayor of London extending free school meals, similar scheme extended in Wales as well. And when you start undermining this idea of universalism, the risk is that you sort of hand a victory to your opponents, and what is going to become for next, what other universal benefits will be undermined in future. And I think that's something I think Labour really does need to consider.
And Steve, what's this a battle that Keir Starmer didn't need to take on?
Well, I suspect that what happened was that because they wanted to talk about the black hole and they wanted to prepare people for the budget and signal to the markets that they would do something about it, I think they were probably looking for what they thought was a legitimate target. And given that there was a lot of speculation about how many people actually used winter fuel allowance for winter fuel, initially it probably seemed like quite a good idea. I think they may have underestimated the backlash. And to be perfectly honest, I think they could have been more creative politically. I mean, the target about winter fuel shouldn't be about how much of the taxpayers' money should go to pensioners. It should be about the standing charge that the energy supply companies are charging people. We could take that away for pensioners tomorrow. They would get exactly the same as they're getting under the winter fuel allowance, except it would come out of unearned profit.
And their own impact assessments acknowledge that there would be thousands of people worse off. Indeed, in opposition, when you were in opposition with Labour, you made exactly that point to the government. So again, it was handing a stick to your opponents to beat you with.
Yeah, I think it was, as I say, it was probably an effort to look tough, to signal to the markets that, you know, they were going to take tough choices. I think that was the intention. And maybe it was to do something to fill the space before the budget rather than fuel other budget speculation. So I think there was probably a reasonable enough political calculation initially, but I don't think it's turned out as well as they might have hoped.
I mean, the Treasury has long disliked this payment, and there have been repeated attempts to push this onto governments of all colours. I think if we look back to Theresa May's manifesto in 2017, the Conservatives actually committed to the same policy and were then forced to abandon it under political pressure after the general election. And I do think this kind of feeds into a sort of broader problem for the Labour Party and for the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. There have been suggestions that she's too much tapped into sort of Treasury way of thinking. And this is very much a sort of Treasury-driven policy that we're seeing here.
Well, I mean, I think that may be true in its absolute origins. I don't think the winter fuel allowance was ever intended to go to all pensioners. I think the trade-off was, in order to deliver it quickly, that was the deal that the Treasury were prepared to do at the time. But I don't think they ever intended, the officials at the Treasury ever intended that to be a long-term policy.
Let's talk about wardrobe gates, Steve, because I think many people, including many Labour supporters, will just find it distasteful and just ask the question, why is a man who's earning 157 grand a year accepting gifts of free clothes and a free pair of specs? Why can't he just go to Specsavers like everyone else?
Well, look, I'm not sure this is a long-term story, but I think in the short term it's probably going to be a bit damaging. I think Keir is suffering a bit from the kind of tall poppy syndrome, you know. One minute he's been built up, this fantastic Labour majority, what a stunning victory. The next minute, chop, chop, chop. And I think he's kind of walked into this one a bit. I mean, I'm not at all sure there's that much in this. I think it's common for all sorts of senior politicians to get these sort of gifts and donations, as it is with lots of senior figures in the media and all sorts of other places. I mean, it's not that unusual. But at a time when he's preaching tighten your belt strategy to the public, it doesn't look great. And I'm not sure he's been brilliantly advised, although he's in a kind of cleft stick. I mean, it was actually his own people who broke the story about his wife's clothes because they thought it was better to get it out in the open. Had they tried to cover it up, it would have been worse. So he's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't.
You just think, well, Lord Wahid Ali has given a donation. What is he expecting in return? I mean, the sleaze which contributed to the public's mistrust of the Conservatives, particularly of Boris Johnson, but not exclusively to Boris Johnson. People were suspicious as well of Rishi Sunak and the level of donations going to the Conservative Party across the years.
To be fair to Wahid Ali, he's been a Labour Party supporter and donor for over 40 years at least. He's not exactly a Johnny-come-lately.
What do these people want? You don't expect to get something for nothing, do you?
Well, I think in Wahid's case, he is actually genuinely a Labour supporter who has worked that hard for Labour governments, and he happens to be in a position to assist financially. I think that is genuinely the case. I know people will find that hard to believe, and there will be all sorts of comparisons with Tory sleaze, but you have to remember, Tory sleaze is the process of 14 years of taking more and more and bending the rules more and more. This is a pretty one-off state of affairs that have happened because Labour put it in the public domain.
We can't really compare this to Boris Johnson's level of sleaze, and it comes nowhere near to scratching the surface even of the PPE scandal with which the last government was complicit. So I don't think we should compare it with that. But I think many Labour supporters or many people who transferred their vote to Labour at the recent election will be very uncomfortable about this.
Yeah, I mean, of course, look, you look at who are making hay with this story. It's the Conservative Party. It's the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail now employing Boris Johnson, of course, who, when he was Prime Minister, used donor money to fund accommodation, holidays, parts of his own wedding, and even sort of takeaway meals that came to Downing Street. But look, Starmer ran on an election opposing all of that. He stood in the House of Commons berating the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson for taking money for wallpaper in Downing Street. He committed repeatedly, again and again and again, to the point of complete boredom, that he was going to restore government to service once he entered Downing Street. So he cannot then be in a position to say, well, these kinds of stories don't matter. It's all trivial. Let's just move on. And if it is about service, you do have to ask the question, who is he serving? I think when it comes to Lord Ali, yes, I think Steve's got a point. He's a long-term Labour supporter. I don't think there's been any suggestion in any of the reporting so far that he sought to get anything back for the donations that he's made to the party. But also he has been involved in eliciting other donations from other business figures. And there has been a huge influx in money to the Labour Party from private origins. So what's just come out in the past week is that prior to the election, the Labour Party received a huge donation from a Cayman Island-based hedge fund, Quadrature, £4 million, which is the sixth largest donation to any political party ever. We're only just learning about this now because it was donated before the election period, so they didn't have to declare it prior to the elections. So you do have to ask about those kinds of donations. What do these businesses, what do these hedge funds and all the rest of it want to see for those kinds of donations, particularly when they're giving it to a party just before they go into government, just before we're likely to have a budget where we're told that lots of money has to be raised, lots of taxes have to be raised. Why does the hedge fund industry want to be donating so much money to a Labour government prior to that process taking on? Is there a quid pro quo there? Is there an assumed quid pro quo there? When Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, suggests that she doesn't want to raise money on the wealthy, when she says that she wants instead to cut departmental budgets, is that related in any way to the donations that the Labour Party has received? We don't know, but it does raise those questions. And I think it's a completely legitimate question. So once we get beyond the sort of the glasses and the dress for Lady Starmer, I think those are really the much more significant questions that I think this scandal, this story raises.
I'd argue it's a continuum, but Steve, what would a Cayman Islands-based hedge fund want to donate money to the Labour Party for?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I haven't a clue. I'd like to know more about them, but I guess Adam's right. Everybody else will want to know more too. Look, it's not that unusual when a party looks like it's going to win the election for money to flow to it. Suddenly you have a lot more friends and businesses are a lot more interested. So that in itself, I don't think is that unusual. But I think Adam's right. The question that will arise will be, who are these people? What are they donating for? And I think that is a much more reasonable question. As I say, my view is Wahid Ali is a long-term Labour supporter. I think it's ridiculous for people to be challenging him. But when you're talking about funds that you don't really know who's controlling, what's behind them, then it's not surprising. I would expect there will be Labour MPs who are asking those questions as well.
Yeah. I suppose there's a bigger question here about our politics, though, isn't there? And if you are an incoming Labour government and you're quite sensibly exploiting the sleaze of your predecessors and saying that we're going to be different, it is an opportunity for a reset for our politics, isn't it? And perhaps to look for different ways of funding, perhaps for public funding for political parties. But it strikes me that Keir Starmer has no appetite for that, and that in terms of how party donations are managed, it's very much business as usual, which continues then to raise the suspicion that government is acting in the interest not of the ordinary people, but acting in the interests of the wealthiest members of society who can afford to make donations.
Well, if you look at the criticism that David Lammy took at the weekend for daring to say that in other countries the president or prime minister gets a clothing allowance, I think arguing for public funding wouldn't exactly go down a storm. And to be perfectly honest, in the fragmented state of our politics at the moment, with all these new parties springing up, I see Jeremy Corbyn's trying to engineer another one. The issue of public funding would be really difficult. So, I mean, I'm in favour of more controls on funding, more explicit information about where it comes from. But I am sceptical about public funding.
Sceptical in the sense that you think the public wouldn't wear it, I think.
Well, I don't think the public would wear it, and I'm not sure it would be the solution that people think it is, because it would just be more money funneled into different groups, and the arguments would be about who was entitled to money then. I mean, if you look at some of the difficulties we've had with short money for the opposition, for example, I can see umpteen fringe groups starting to demand their entitlement for money.
Although, arguably, you could set a threshold, couldn't you, whether it was 5% of the vote or a certain number of seats in Parliament. But anyway, there is potentially a solution if there's a will. It's whether there's a will, I suppose. Adam, let's talk about Sue Gray's pay. That's the headline, and she's earning more than Keir Starmer. But Chris Mason, the BBC political correspondent who broke the story, I think rightly pointed out that that isn't really the story, is it? The story is that there are people very close to Keir Starmer who are willing to dish the dirt on his key advisor.
Yeah, I mean, you always get warring factions within government, you get competing advisors. You don't tend to get these things emerging within weeks and months of a new government coming into power. So that's definitely a change. I think there is a sort of backstory to this, which is that over recent months, there has been a reduction in real terms in the pay given to special advisors at the top of government. But the people at the very top, the very senior spads like Sue Gray, have seen their pay go up. So there is a kind of personnel sort of HR issue there, which is kind of behind some of the briefings. But yes, it's certainly not a very good sign for the government that we're already getting these kinds of stories coming out. I mean, as to whether or not she's paid too much, I think that's something of a red herring. I think she's actually paid, if you look in terms of inflation, similar amounts to previous occupants of that role under the Conservatives, both in real terms, I think, and once you account for inflation as well. But I think, yes, there certainly is an issue of some people within Downing Street unhappy about her and unhappy about the sort of the excessive powers they see that she has. She's certainly a very powerful chief of staff. She has a huge influence. Obviously, she's got the background within the civil service, so she's got a lot of influence over the civil service, as well as influence politically and closeness to Keir Starmer. And I think some of the other advisors around Keir Starmer are not particularly happy about that. But yes, it's unusual for this to all be emerging quite so early.
Well, I think it's always a problem when the advisor or the official becomes the story. I mean, someone like Sue Gray should be kind of behind the scenes. It's a bit like when Alistair Campbell became the story. He eventually had to go. I think it is surprising. I've never met Sue Gray, to the best of my knowledge, although people who know her say she is very talented. I mean, there's been controversy about her since day one, though, because the Tories have had it in for her since it was announced that she was going to work for Keir Starmer. I'm not sure at the moment. I think it has all the ingredients that you describe of a rumbling row. And as I say, when the person becomes the story, I think it gets in the way of them doing their job, and it could become problematic down the line. The issue about the money, I always think it's daft that anyone in government gets paid more than the Prime Minister, but, there you go. That's how it is. I'm not sure the issue about the money is the big thing. I think there will be, and there probably are, some tensions. At the moment, I think they're just the natural tensions of the early days in government. But if they begin to divide into camps, then she could find herself the unfortunate victim of people who will make it very hard for her to do her job. And as I say, the Tories have a vested interest in taking her out. So she is quite vulnerable in some respects.
Yeah, of course, because she carried out the independent review into the COVID parties that ultimately nailed Boris Johnson, didn't she? So that's one reason why the Tories particularly don't like her. On the positive side, Steve, you look at Labour delivering on its promise to outlaw no-fault evictions. Various strikes have been sorted. Obviously, there is a price to pay for that in terms of the public purse, but equally, there was a price to pay for not sorting them either. So junior doctors, train drivers, nurses, and so on. So there will be practical benefits felt in the country as a result of the early months of this government.
Yeah, and in fact, the strikes have largely been settled on the basis of peer reviews. So all we've done is honour them, in a sense. I don't think they've got that much credit. I think that he had a very short-lived, Adam talked earlier about a short-lived honeymoon. I think this government's had a very short-lived honeymoon. That may be because the size of the majority was more down to the influence of reform than anything else. I think they've really got to use their party conference to sell a slightly more kind of positive message, reinforce the good they've done, the good they intend to do, and the change that they hope is going to come. I think he's got a real opportunity. You know, if ever a conference has to be more than a jamboree, I think it's this one.
Yes, indeed. And as we're recording this, we're just ahead of that Labour Party conference. Adam, there are pluses there are positives there, which, away from these headlines, some of which may be short-lived, there have been changes which will materially affect the lives of ordinary people in this country.
Yeah, I think in some respects they've got quite a good story to tell. We've had already these pay disputes that have been rumbling on for a very long time. They've settled that very quickly. People in the public sector who have seen real terms cuts in their pay, those have been increased. We've had the Miranda scheme has been scrapped. We've had announcements of new rights for workers, new moves on housing, on green energy. So there's lots of kind of positive stories there. The problem is, I think a lot of it's been kind of undermined by some of the other actions of the government. So on the Miranda scheme, I think they rightly scrapped that. I think it was a terrible scheme. But then Keir Starmer goes off to Italy this week and meets with the far-right leader of Italy and talks about immigration and their Albanian deportation scheme. You have putting more money into the public sector with pay rises, and then you have this sort of needless dispute over winter fuel payments and the suggestion that we're heading back to austerity in the budget. So it does seem like they're sort of at odds with themselves. And I think a lot of this is down to the messaging and the overall messaging of the government. And ultimately, that does come back to Keir Starmer. And I think when we look forward to the party conference, this is going to be a real moment for the Prime Minister to actually tell that story about the difference that the Labour government has already made and will make over the coming years. Because ultimately, a lot of this stuff, about Sue Gray and about football tickets and all the rest of it, this isn't going to be remembered in 4 years' time. What will be remembered is whether or not a Labour government has made the lives of ordinary people better, whether hospitals are people are able to get their appointments quickly, whether school roofs are still crumbling. If they can fix that, if they can take decisions now in terms of the upcoming autumn statement, they're going to fix those things and make the lives for people in the country much better, then all of this other stuff is going to be forgotten. But I think now is the time for those big decisions. Now is the time for Keir Starmer to tell that story and for Rachel Reeves to make the economic decisions that are going to make the long-term difference and actually decide whether or not this is a one-term Labour government or a longer one.
Adam, appreciate your time. Thank you. As always, Adam Bienkov, Byline Times political editor. Thanks to Steve McCabe, who for many years was the MP for Birmingham Selly Oak. We'll speak to Steve again, I'm sure, in forthcoming episodes. Don't forget as well to check out our brilliant podcast channel, bylineaudio.com. We've got some great podcasts on there with the likes of Hardeep Matharu, the Byline Times editor, and Bonnie Greer. We've got Otto English and John Mitchinson with Utter Bollocks. So head over to bylineaudio.com to see our full panoply of Byline Audio offerings. This has been Adrian Goldberg signing off for Byline Audio. We'll see you again very soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Byline Audio.